right, thank you. Yeah, so thank you, Saurav, for the introduction. As Saurav mentioned, I'll talk about accountability in threshold decryption with applications to encrypted mempools and beyond. So this is a joint work with Dan and Aditi. All of us should be here at a certain point, so you should definitely come and talk to us if you're interested. So yeah, let's get started. So I'm sure that MEV needs no introduction here, but just that we're all on the same page. This is our mempool. For the sake of this talk, let's just think about it as a bunch of unfinalized transactions floating around in the clear. Right? As it turns out that since we have all of this information, we can actually use it in order to extract value. So how do we do that? Well, if we can influence the transactions that go into the next block and maybe also the order of them, then there's some value to be had there. So as an extreme example, think of a block proposer, for example, that observes the transactions that are in the mempool, maybe posts a new transaction, and then proposes a block that benefits them financially somehow. Right? So this can be front running, back running, some arbitrage opportunity, and so forth. So, in and of itself, you might wonder, well, why is this bad? So as it turns out, it does raise quite a few concerns. So right off the bat, this is a fairness issue, right? I mean, some parties can profit potentially at the expense of other parties. It can and does drive fees up. It can cause centralization in the network, some sort of rich get richer kind of phenomenon, and so forth. So with these concerns in mind, many people, many projects have tried to somehow counter this MEV problem. And today, I want to focus on one proposed mitigation, which is encrypted mempools. Yeah, so what's the idea here? So the idea is that MEV is enabled by all of this information just flying around in the clear in the mempool. So if we can hide most of this information, maybe it will be much harder to extract value by manipulating the next block. And so the idea is to just encrypt the transactions once you upload them to the mempool. Let's say we all encrypt to some common public key, and then the hope is that the mempool now contains much less information about the transactions, so it should be much harder to extract value from it. The question now that arises is, well, how do we decrypt, right? At the end of the day, we want the transactions themselves to be unchained and not encryptions thereof. And if we all encrypt to some common public key, someone has to have the secret key in order to decrypt. And we don't want the secret key to be with one party because then we're back to square one. So how do we decrypt? And the answer is that we use threshold decryption by the validators. Okay, so this is what we'll do. And I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a couple of slides. But before that, just so that we're on the same page, I want to say what I mean by threshold decryption. So with threshold decryption, you can just think of it as a public key encryption in which the secret key is shared among different parties. So in this example, we have 4 parties. We have some public key, and every party has their own private secret key, so SK1, SK2, and so forth. And you need a quorum of this party, a threshold of these parties, in this case 3 in this example, in order to decrypt. Right? So encryption behaves just like typical public key encryption. You take the message, you encrypt it with respect to some public key, and you get a ciphertext. And to decrypt, every party can use this ciphertext and their own local secret key in order to produce a decryption share. And the guarantee is that if you have enough of these shares, again, in this example 3, you can combine them to get the message M back. All right, so just to recap, we need 2 properties. One is correctness, so any T partial decryption shares should be sufficient in order to reconstruct the message. And as for security, any even T-1 secret keys reveal essentially nothing about the message in some computational sense. Okay, so this is threshold decryption. So how do we put this to use to construct encrypted mempools? Well, the idea is to give these secret keys to the validators, and then when a validator signs a block, they also partially decrypt the transactions in it. Yeah, so we have our first validator, they sign the block and decrypt the transactions, the second, and so forth. And if we set the decryption threshold to be the same as the consensus threshold, well then, once we have enough signatures, we also have enough partial decryptions in order to decrypt the transactions in the block. All right, so this is what I just said. And since we set the thresholds to be the same, the guarantee is that transactions are only revealed once they're finalized. All right, so this is the idea for encrypted mempools. So, are we done? If the answer was yes, then this would have been a short talk. So we're not done. And we're not done because of the following question. Well, what happens if secret keys are leaked? So this kind of is related to a question from the last talk. So let's go back to our example. 4 users, a threshold of 3. So let's imagine that an adversary comes along and offers to bribe 3 of the users in return for their secret keys. Well, in this case, we're back to square one. Now this adversary knows enough information in order to see what transactions are in the mempool, and they can run MEV extraction. And I would argue that we're even in a worse situation because we can think that that we don't have an MEV problem even though we do. Right? So this potentially is even worse than having an MEV problem. So what do we do? What I would argue that what we need is accountability. So before I tell you what I mean by accountability, I want to argue that in current threshold decryption schemes, we don't have accountability in the following sense. So leaking validators cannot be identified, and we'll say something about this in a few slides. And even worse, honest parties can be framed in the sense that if you have enough of these secret keys, you can actually compute the secret keys of the other parties. So if enough parties collude, they can actually leak the secret keys of parties that do not collude. Right? So this is very bad. It means essentially that you don't have accountability, and it also offers a risk-free incentive to actually leak your secret, right? In some sense. So you leak your secret, you cannot be caught. If someone offers you money to do this, why wouldn't you, right? So what we need is a mechanism to hold these parties accountable. For example, we can slash them if we catch them leaking their secret keys. And hopefully, if we can do that, then that would serve as a deterrent against leaking your secret key, right? I mean, we can't somehow, short of physical solutions like these, we can't really prevent you from leaking your key. But if we can somehow hold you accountable, then hopefully this will deter you from leaking your secret key. All right. So this is what we want. Unfortunately, threshold decryption existed for over 30 years, and we didn't really have this notion of accountability. And I would argue that this is not just for lack of trying, it's also because there's some underlying tension here, right? So on the one hand, you want any T subset of the parties to be able to decrypt to the same message. Right? So functionally, any T subset of the keys should behave the same. But for accountability, you need any T subset of the keys to behave differently. Right? Otherwise, you cannot have accountability, and we'll see why. Right? So there is some tension here, but there is still hope to get accountability. And the reason I say this is because we do know of an example of a threshold crypto system in which we can have some sort of a threshold behavior and also accountability. And this example is accountable threshold signatures. Right? So accountable threshold signatures are just threshold signatures in which a signature identifies the signing quorum. So if you look at a signature, you know who signed. And we do have many efficient constructions for this notion. So we have a trivial construction. You can just take any single user signature scheme and just concatenate all of the signatures. So this works, and it's actually used widely in practice. And we also know of more efficient constructions like music, pairing-based constructions, and so forth. All right, so there is hope. And we actually use this as the basis for proof-of-stake blockchains. Right? So essentially, the example that we saw before, in which the validator signs the block, is or can be thought of as an accountable threshold signature. And if someone misbehaves, then we can use this accountability in order to punish them. All right, so what we want is a similar mechanism to the one we have in threshold signatures, but in threshold decryption. All right, so what we do in this work is first we define accountability in threshold decryption. So we say what we mean by accountability here, or we give one interpretation for accountability. There could be others. And then we construct a threshold decryption scheme or several threshold decryption schemes that satisfy these definitions. All right, so I'll talk about the definitions at a high level, and then I'll talk about the constructions. The definitions, I'll try to keep them less technical. The constructions will inevitably be somewhat more technical, but still I'll try to keep everything high level. All right, so the idea for accountability follows a similar notion of accountability that exists in public key encryption or broadcast encryption, which is tracing or threaded tracing, right? So the idea is that if I detect a leak, if I can trace it back to one of the parties who contributed to it, then I can punish them, and this should serve as a deterrent. So let's go back to our example. We have our 3 leaking parties. So what we want is to take this leak, SK1, SK2, SK3, and trace it back to one of them. And as I mentioned, the hope is that this would deter them from leaking. So what do we mean by a leak, right? I mean, if parties leak their secret keys as is, well, then tracing is trivial, right? Or it's trivial to come up with a threshold decryption scheme in which tracing is trivial. So let's think of the following example. Let's say that a secret key for party I is just some functional secret key, SKI prime, that you actually use for decryption, and also a message that says, I'm the secret key of party I. Well, in this case, if the party leaks SKI as is, then it's very easy to trace, right? I just look at the message in the secret key and trace it back to the party. Well, but then parties won't really leak the secret key as is, right? So in this naive example, they can just leak SKI prime, and then we're back to square one. And even worse, they can actually leak SKI prime, and I'm the secret key of party J, and then we'll trace this back to party J instead of party I. Right? So this is not a good modeling of a leak. We can't just assume that parties leak secret keys as is. And we need a somewhat more general leakage model that makes sense. So what we do, following previous work on threaded tracing, is we model the leakage as a decryption box or a decoder. Right? So what is this decoder? It's just an algorithm that has the secret keys embedded in it in some way that we know nothing about. And this algorithm takes in a ciphertext and outputs a message. So it decrypts. And I would argue that this captures essentially any functional leakage, right? Any leakage that can be used for decryption can be thought of as an algorithm that decrypts. And if the leakage cannot be used for decryption, well, we don't care, right? So this is how we would think of leakage. All right, so going back to our example, now our goal is to trace this algorithm, this decoder box, back to one of the parties who contributed to it. And this is provably impossible in standard or your typical threshold decryption schemes because, as we mentioned, there, the set of colluding parties here can actually compute SK4, right? So they can also embed, in some intuitive sense, SK4 in the box, and then the box contains no information about who produced it. All right, so we need to come up with a new threshold decryption scheme in order to do that. All right, so let's talk about how do we actually construct a threshold decryption scheme that satisfies this traceability notion. So maybe let's restate our goal here. We want to construct a threshold decryption scheme in which if you give me a good decryption box, then I can trace it back to one of the parties who contributed to it. So what do I mean by good here? For the sake of this talk, let's just think of a box that always decrypts valid ciphertexts. Yeah? So our construction, or a family of constructions, is based on a primitive called fingerprinting codes. And I'll define these in a second. And then we get a family of constructions depending on the assumption that you want to make. So from, we have a kind of a proof of concept construction from any threshold public key encryption, in which the parameters are worse than the other constructions. We have a discrete log-based construction in which the ciphertext is constant size and the public key is roughly quadratic in the number of parties. And we have a pairing-based construction in which both the ciphertext and the public key are constant size. Right? And in all of these cases, the secret key is roughly quadratic in the number of parties. So I would argue that this pairing-based construction is actually great, or presents a great trade-off for encrypted mempools and for blockchains in general, because typically you would think of ciphertexts and the public keys to be on-chain, or at least in ciphertext you need to communicate every time, but the secret key you keep locally, so presumably this is a less expensive storage than the public key and the ciphertext. And just to give you some intuition as to the numbers, so if you have a few hundred parties, then the secret keys are in the hundreds of megabytes, and the public key and ciphertext are just 3 group elements. All right. I should mention that also in the paper we have a different construction that presents a different trade-off, but I won't talk about it today. All right. So this is our goal. Given a good decryption box, trace it back to the parties who contributed to it. And the idea, well, since this box is good, it behaves the same on all valid ciphertexts. So the idea would be to look at how it behaves on invalid ciphertexts that you won't actually encounter in the standard use of this decryption scheme. And from this information, we'll actually extract one colluding party. So the tool that we will use is fingerprinting codes. This was introduced by Bonan Shah and later used in the context of trader tracing. So a fingerprinting code is just a set of words that is traceable in some way. So in what way? So if you give me a word, W prime, that was constructed from a subset of the words in the code, I can actually trace this W prime back to one of the words that was used to construct it. So what do I mean by that? Let's say that we have this subset W of words. It's the first word, 7th word, 24th, and 29th word. Well, all of these words agree on certain positions, right? So the first bit is 0 in all of them, the 4th bit is 1, and so forth. Well, if you give me a word that's constructed from them in the sense that it agrees with all of them on these locations, then I have some tracing algorithm that takes this word, maybe also some additional tracing key, and gives me an index that corresponds to one of the words in W. Right? So this algorithm traces W star to the set capital W. All right. So how do you use this in order to construct a public key encryption scheme that is traceable? We're still not in the threshold setting yet. Well, you generate some fingerprinting code with these properties. And for each position in a code word, you have 2 public key encryption key pairs. So for the first position, we have 2, SK10, PK10, and the SK11, PK11. And you should think about it as corresponding to the first bit of the code word being 0, and the first bit of the code word being 1, and so forth. We do this for every bit of the code word. And the public key then is just a concatenation of everything. And the secret key of party I is L secret keys. Well, which secret keys? The secret keys that correspond to the word WI. Yeah? So the bottom row, this should be 1 through L. All right, so as an example, let's say the WI is this word. Well, party I gets the secret keys that correspond to this word. And to encrypt, what you do, you just randomly sample an index, and you encrypt with both public keys that correspond to this index. Yeah, and you can see that if I'm party I should have either the secret key that corresponds to PKJ0 or the secret key that corresponds to PKJ1, so I can decrypt. All right? So this is how you use fingerprinting codes for traceable public key encryption. And I should mention that this public key can actually be compressed to constant size using the IBE techniques, or identity-based encryption techniques. All right, so why is this secure? And this will be important for the threshold generalization. So a coalition C of the parties that colludes holds some subset of the secret keys, right? So let's say that it's this subset. So in some locations, the coalition holds both secret keys, but in some positions, the coalition only holds one of the secret keys. Yeah? So if we can pinpoint in which of the positions the coalition only holds one of the secret keys and which of the two secret keys it holds, then maybe we can use this information in order to trace a decoder box back to the coalition. So this is what I just said. The important observation here is that if the coalition only holds, let's say, skj0, then it cannot distinguish between the fact that the second ciphertext is an encryption of the actual message M or just some junk encryption of 0. And for this information, you can actually infer which secret keys the coalition holds. You construct intuitively a code word from this information, and then you can use the tracing properties of the fingerprinting code in order to trace this back to one of the colluding parties. Okay, so now, so this is what I mentioned. You feed D with invalid ciphertext, you see where it fails, and then you construct a code word. Okay, so now we want to extend this to the threshold setting. As a naive attempt, you can think of just replacing the public key encryption with a threshold decryption scheme. Yeah? So now the public key is the same, but now these public keys are public keys of a threshold decryption scheme and not a public key encryption scheme. And the party I gets all of the secret keys that belong to it with respect to the public keys that match WI, the ith word in the code. But this doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? There's a correctness issue. A quorum of T parties should be able to decrypt because it contains T parties, but the secret keys of these parties might not match. Right? Some might correspond to PKJ0, but some might correspond to PKJ1. These are independent, so you can't combine them in order to get the message back. Yeah? You cannot decrypt this. All right, so what we need actually is a threshold decryption scheme that has two properties that seem conflicting, but it turns out that they're not. So one is two-sided correctness that essentially says that I can decrypt even if my keys do not match, right? I have some keys that correspond to PKJ0 and some keys that correspond to PKJ1, still I should be able to decrypt. On the other hand, if you recall the security intuition that we kind of outlined for the Bonanno-Or construction for tracing for public encryption, we need this one-sided security property that says that if you only have secret keys that correspond to PKJ0, you shouldn't be able to distinguish between these two encryptions. Yeah, so this seems somewhat conflicting. It turns out that it's not. We actually have, we call this primitive bipartite threshold of public encryption, and we actually have constructions that match our accountable threshold decryption constructions, right? So we construct this primitive, and from that, we easily get an accountable threshold decryption scheme. All right, so these are the same parameters that we saw before. All right, so let me conclude, and to conclude, I want to take a step back and talk about accountability and threshold cryptography in general. So most threshold cryptography relies on like a general recipe that takes a single user cryptographic primitive. It takes the secret key for this primitive, secret shares it. We saw this in the previous slide, in the previous talk, sorry. And from that, you get a threshold construction. Yeah? But this general recipe is provably non-accountable, right? And also accountable threshold signatures kind of depart from this general recipe. And the reason why this is not accountable is that all signatures or decryptions look the same, and you can actually even compute the secret keys of the other parties if you have enough secret keys. So does this mean that cryptography or threshold cryptography means sacrificing accountability? Well, we saw that the answer is no, right? We talked about accountable threshold decryption that we just saw, and we also mentioned that we have constructions for accountable threshold signatures. So we don't have to sacrifice accountability in threshold cryptography. And I want to mention two related works that unfortunately I didn't have the time to talk about today. So one is from Last Financial Crypto that talks about how you do proactive refresh for accountable threshold signatures. This is something that we didn't know how to do before. And the second one is kind of a more basic work that will be in this year's crypto. So you're welcome to come and hear about this there. That talks about accountable secret sharing. So how do you do tracing for leakage in secret sharing, and potentially this is basic enough so that we can construct accountable threshold cryptography from it, VRFs, and beyond. All right, there's much left to explore in this field, and just to wrap up, we talked about accountability and threshold cryptography, or threshold decryption, sorry. We saw how to construct it. We mentioned that this can be used in order to construct accountable encrypted mempools. And in general, we saw that accountability is very important when you do threshold crypto. Yeah, so this is the link to the ePrint, and thank you.
Thank you, Lior. We have time for questions.
Hi, very nice talk. I learn a lot. I have a question. My question is more from the application setting that you talk about mempool. What if these parties who are colluding, they come together, but they do not output things online. They just do that locally, figure out what's there in that plain text, in that encryption, and then order according to the way they want. And in that case, we won't be able to trace that one of the parties. Right, so the black box you presented, its output should be available to public, as I understand, right?
So yeah, so the model here is that the leak somehow is that, you know, a colluding party or a colluding subset sells their shares. It's true that, you know, in the context of encrypted mempools, if enough parties collude, and they collude, you know, not in order to sell their shares, but they collude in order to run some MEV extractor themselves, then yeah, things break down, right? I mean, this is a mitigation. It's not a foolproof solution, and I guess it goes to the question that Aline was asked in the previous talk as well. What happens if enough parties collude? So, you know, this is a mitigation. It kind of deters against certain types of collusions, but sure, I mean, you can still envision attacks.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk, Lior. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Thanks for your talk. So my question is, if you could use threshold encryption and decryption systems where the few colluding parties cannot find out the keys of the rest of the parties. You mentioned most of them have this property, but not all. Yeah.
So yeah, the construction that's suggested here obviously satisfies this right? It's a prerequisite to having traceability. So yeah, the construction here, it's essentially the only one that I know of, because, you know, the only reason you would want a subset of the parties not to be able to compute the secret keys of other parties, if they meet the threshold, is to allow accountability, right? So this is, the constructions here are examples of such schemes.
But previously in the literature, there wasn't anything like that?
For threshold decryption, no. What I know of is just, you know, you take the secret key and you share it, you Shamir secret share it across the decryptors, and then this doesn't hold.
Great, thanks.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I have two questions. The first question is this good box assumption. That's kind of where things might not go well, right, in practice. Is that fair to say?
So, you know, this good box assumption was kind of a simplified assumption here for this talk. Essentially, in the paper, the definition is much more inclusive. So the box, as long as it's, you know, it breaks semantic security with like a non-negligible probability, then you can trace, right? So essentially, any information that you can use in order to infer something about the transactions in this example, you can trace.
Mm-hmm. So in practice, this good box assumption cannot be broken by the colluders?
Not unless they give you information that you can't use in order, you know, they can give you junk information that you can't really use, right? But if the information that they give you can be used in order to infer something meaningful about the message, then you can trace.
Okay, and my second question is, we know that silent setup threshold decryption does a little bit better in terms of accountability because you cannot frame people at least. Is it easy to take these results and apply to silent setup setting?
No. The answer is no. I mean, this is, you know, here the secret keys have a very specific structure to them.
Do you have any
you know,
thoughts
for silent setup, you don't have this property that you can compute secret keys of other parties, but I don't know of, you know, a tracing or a different tracing procedure there. But yeah, that's a good direction. Yeah.
Cool.
Hi, hello. Thank you for the talk. This might have been mentioned in one of the previous questions, but this scheme only allows you to detect a single person, right? So like in particular, a colluding coalition could like pick someone to have only like one stake and make sure that person is the only one that's found, execute some like MEV opportunity, and then pay that guy off chain. So
yes and no, right? Yes, in the sense that this only allows you to identify one colluding party, but the cheating coalition doesn't get to choose this party.
So you're saying
as far as a cheating coalition would know, you catch a random party.
I see.
Yeah, so this hopefully serves as a deterrent. I should mention, by the way, that a good open question is, can you actually detect all of the colluding parties? Yeah, so if you're familiar with traitor tracing for public key encryption, even if a subset collude, you can't really hope to detect more than one party. Here, that's not true, right? Here, in order to manufacture a good box, you actually need information from T colluding parties, so there is hope maybe to detect all of the T colluding parties. Yeah, so that's a good open question.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have one last question, maybe similar to what many people have asked. So you said that you are querying this box on an invalid ciphertext and are using the output to identify. If the box somehow already has this function which first verifies whether the ciphertext is valid or not, maybe after decryption, and acts accordingly, then will it still work?
So how do you verify?
Maybe, I don't know, decrypt and re-encrypt?
No, but it's a randomized encryption, right? I mean, you would get a different ciphertext, but this is not proof that the first ciphertext was invalid. You could think of, the box maybe wants a proof that this is a valid ciphertext, but that's, even there, with enough information, you can maybe manufacture a false proof and so forth, but it's kind of, it depends on how you define things. But you could potentially do things even there.
Okay. Let's thank Lior and all the speakers, and let's go for lunch.